Ladies and gentlemen, welcome today to the show, and we're now continuing from price elasticity of demand, which we looked at the last episode, to price elasticity of supply. Just like demand curves come in all different shapes, similarly supply curves also come in all different shapes. They are not necessarily all at 45 degrees. Let us now investigate that in a little bit more detail. PES, price elasticity in demand, in supply. Now, remember that when we looked at elasticity of demand, right, we looked at the demand curve that we saw in our previous episode, shows the relationship between price and quantity. And when we look at price elasticity of demand, we look at the degree that a change in quantity is sensitive. How sensitive is it to a change in price? And then we're talking about the quantity demanded, right? Does a change in price, a slight change in price, mean there will be a huge difference in the quantity demanded? Or could a huge change in price not make a difference or much of a difference to the quantity demanded? Right? When it's sensitive, it is price elastic in demand. And when it is insensitive, it is price elastic in supply. Exactly the same principle applies to, price elasticity of demand. Exactly the same principle applies to supply. When we introduced the supply curve, it was like this. Quick reminder, price, quantity. Here we have a 45-degree supply curve. And let's say that what we're supplying is, all right, fast food. Right? And the price of a unit, the going rate, the going rate, which means how far the suppliers of fast food are being rewarded, which is the price. That's the motivation, will mean that Q1 units of fast food are going to be produced. If, let's say, it goes up by 50%, that instead of the going rate for fast food is $4, it goes up to $6, right? Then what's going to happen is we're going to have the following. P2 is up to here, Q2 is here. Here is $4, here is $6. The price went up, the price has gone up by 50%. The quantity, therefore, has also gone up by 50%. Because when the rewards for producing fast food, right, go from $4, which is the reward, payment, to $6, you're going to get a lot more people producing fast food. And a much higher quantity of fast food is going to be produced. So let's express this mathematically, right? We said that PES is like PED. Right? It's a percentage change in quantity. So far it's exactly the same as PED, but divided by percentage in price. Also the same as PED. But unlike PED, we're going to get a plus. Right? So in this case, it would go up by 50%. And the quantity is also, price has gone up by 50%. The quantity has also gone up by 50%. Equals 1. Right? That is the price elasticity of supply. And when we get a situation like that, like for example, typically for fast food, right? We would say that the fast food has got a unitary supply curve, right? That means that it's not under-sensitive, that production of fast food is sensitive to a change in price, but it's proportional. It's not oversensitive and it's not undersensitive. Now let's have a look at some other products which would actually show different supply curves. So we'll clear this first. Let's clear this little bit of board. So have something to clear it with. We can use this. This will be fine. Just a job. Paper handkerchiefs have got their uses. Paper handkerchiefs. Take this off here. And we're going to keep the thing. And let's pick now something like, well, here in Israel, this is the persimmon season. Persimmons are one of my favourite fruits. Right, so let's see what the persimmon harvest looks like. And I'd say it looks like this. That's the supply of persimmons. Now, persimmons grow. Farmers grow them. So let's say the going rate for a persimmon is this. For a nice juicy persimmons, locally grown, fresh fruits. Then what happens is that suddenly they get very popular and the price goes up. And everybody wants more persimmons. Well, sorry mate, we can't do this for you. We can't suddenly create huge numbers of persimmons to satisfy the market. Now what the farmers might do is they might increase the quantity a little bit more by picking perhaps borderline persimmons that wouldn't normally qualify. But what happens is that the price might go, so what happens is that if the price might go up, suddenly the going rate for persimmons goes up by 50%, right from P1 to P2, right, the number that's going to be supplied to the market, right, they might manage to get an extra 10%. Okay? So therefore PES for persimmons would be change in quantity, which would be 50%. Change in quantity, which would be 10%. See, here's 10% increase, divided by 50%, which was the change in price, right? Change in quantity over change in price, which would equal 0.2. Now, that's very important, because when the coefficient is between, for PES, like PED, is between 0 and 1, then it is price inelastic. Right? Then it is price elastic in supply. When it is more than 0.1, then it is price, when it's more than 1, right, then it is price elastic in supply. Same as with price elasticity of demand. When it's 1 only, like with the case of the fast food, then it is neither elastic nor is it inelastic, right? It is unitary. So therefore we'll say with persimmons is 0.2, therefore persimmons are PES inelastic. Are we happy about that so far? Now, let's have a look at another product. Clean the board. And we'll pick something which is price elastic in supply. Now, quick warning. There's a rule. A quick rule rather than a warning. Think about persimmons. What type of industry are they? We're going to introduce two new terms. One term is called, get a different pen, primary industry. And the other one is called secondary. We're talking about primary industry and secondary industry. What is the difference between them? Let me explain. When we're talking about primary industry, right, we are talking about things that come out that are come out of the ground, extractive industries. So we're talking about things that, we're talking about farming, we're talking about fishing, okay, fish come out of the sea, not out of the ground. We're talking about forestry, the 3 Fs, farming, fishing and forestry. And we're also talking about mining. What they've all got in common is that they are raw materials and they are extracted from the ground. These are primary products. Now, when you're dealing with a primary product, you can't really change from one primary product to the other primary product. If, for example, you've got a village which is full of fishermen, which is a primary product, and then suddenly they put a ban on fishing herrings, which is the main thing, the main fish over there, people can't, there aren't any other fish to catch, okay? So therefore they're out of business. What are you going to do with them? Similarly with coal miners. Where I grew up in the United Kingdom, right, in the 1980s, Britain stopped producing coal. What are you going to do with coal miners? Right? If they can't easily change over and produce something else. You either open a coal mine or you close a coal mine. Right? So therefore coal is something from mining that is really price inelastic in supply. Now, why this is important is as follows. Because if for example, if a country is used to producing, its basic economy is based on, say, fishing, or it's based on cocoa beans producing chocolate, or it's any other primary product, mining, and then suddenly there is no longer a demand for the product, or a very low demand for the product, right? Then they can't just jump out. It means that the price is going to go down, and so not just the price will go down, that's a consequence, but they will continue supplying at the same amount because they've got no choice. What else can they do with their products? They can't, if a place is used to producing coal, right, and then suddenly there's a world demand for computers, coal miners can't convert and produce computers. They're stuck with the coal. They've got to sell it at any price that they can. So therefore it's price inelastic in supply because it is a primary product. We will return to this issue when we look at issues in development economics. And one of the reasons why countries that are dependent on such primary goods have got serious problems with development because what they tend to produce is price elastic in supply, right? And therefore it's difficult for them to be able to convert from producing one thing to another. Let's now go and have a look at something that's price elastic in supply. Now, whereas we said that primary industry, which is mining, forestry, farming and fishing, right, extractive industries, tend to be price inelastic in supply, right? Secondary industries, which is another name for factories, manufacturing, right, tend to be more price elastic in supply. For example, let's say that we're dealing with bagels. Right? We all like bagels with cream cheese. And the going rate for bagel sandwiches, cream cheese, shallots, bit of tomato, an onion, nice piece of smoked salmon inside, $5. Right? The going rate for a nice toasted bagel sandwich is $5. At the same time, the going rate for a baguette is also $5. Now, assume that it takes the same amount of energy and the same amount of capital, land, labour and capital, to produce a baguette at $5, a baguette sandwich is a bagel sandwich. All of a sudden, what happens is that the going rate for bagels goes up from $5 to $6. That means that people are prepared to pay more for their bagels, right, than they're prepared to pay for their baguettes. What's going to be happening is that you're going to get people who previously produced bagels saying, we can do better, baguettes saying, we can do better with our bagels. Let's produce bagels instead. Now that means that because they're getting more for their bagels, they will convert their shop to produce bagels, which shouldn't be too expensive. It's not like a person who's producing persimmons who just all of a sudden decides that he wants to produce guavas. He can't do that. He's stuck with his persimmons because it's a primary industry. But if a person that's used to serving bagels, all of a sudden, baguettes, all of a sudden finds that there's more money in bagels, he'll be more than happy, and he'll quite easily be able to train his workers for a couple of days, so that instead of there being their premier baguette outlet, they are now the premier bagel outlet. You understand? That's an example of something which is price elastic in supply. Let's now have a look at it. Bagels. So we go back and draw this on the board, right? And we've got a different curve. Take this off. Right, we're going to give you an example from secondary industry, and what we're going to look at now is bagels. Now, let's assume that below P1 there will not be a single bagel, say below $3, there will not be a single bagel sandwich produced in town. At $3, there'll be this amount. At $4, there'll be that amount. Or so let's use the examples before. At $4, it'll be this amount. At $6, it's going to be that amount. See, we've got a very elastic supply curve. So at let's say that P1 is $4 and P2 is $6. So let's get rid of the Q's. That's going to be the quantity 1. And then what's going to happen is that when the price goes up, and what's the reason? Perhaps the demand has gone up or whatever, but the price has gone up from $4 to $6. Wow, look what's happening. If this is a 50% up, right, the price has gone up by 50%, or rather the reward has gone up by 50%, that is a real motivation, right, an incentive to produce a lot more bagels in town. So you've moved whoosh up to Q2. So it's gone up by 50%, but the price has gone up by 50%, but the quantity supplied has gone up by 200%. So therefore bagels are very, very sensitive to changes in price. So therefore, PES for bagels is percentage change in quantity over percentage change in price, which would be 200% over 50%, which would be 4. Now, as it's more than 1, right? As the price elasticity of supply is more than 1, therefore it will say that bagels are highly price elastic in supply. Now, just because something's price elastic in supply does not necessarily mean it's going to be price elastic in demand. The two aren't related. There are plenty of things that are price elastic in demand and price inelastic in supply, and vice versa. Right? But what has happened is that we need to know about elasticities of supply. One reason is in order to know what the pluses and minuses are on what you're producing. Before you actually go into business, are you able, right, how price inelastic is your product? If it's inelastic, you may be facing troubles, right, if you have to change. If it's if it's elastic, you have to change from A to B because you're not getting enough of a reward. It's much easier to be able to do so. And on the whole, primary products tend to be price inelastic in supply, and secondary products tend to be price elastic in supply. That's not necessarily true of demand, but it's certainly true of supply. Now, let's finish this off by looking at 3 factors which actually determine whether a particular product is price elastic in supply or whether it is price inelastic in supply. And let's go through them. Right, so let's just clean the board. Take this off. and let's have a look at 3 factors, right, which decide whether the thing is price elastic in supply or whether a particular product will be price inelastic in supply. Firstly, so let's have a look at determinants of PES, a price elasticity of supply. Let's look at 3 of them. The first one we're going to be having a look at is the nature of the product. Right? Is it a primary product? Or is it a secondary product? Right? If it's a primary product, then what's likely to happen is there are likely to be a lot of what you call sunk costs. S-U-N-K, costs. What is a sunk cost? That means that you've got to put an awful lot of money into the product, into the business, before you get your first ever. If you, for example, want to grow avocados, right, and you want to open an avocado farm, you'll probably cost you the land, the labour and the capital, and it'll be quite a few years before you produce the first marketable avocado. If you're going to sink a mine in order to be able to produce coal, right, it costs a lot of money to be able to sink a mine and get to the coal. So you put a great deal of money in. Once you put a great deal of money in, and you've got lots of land, labour and capital tied to the product, like with a coal mine, it's very hard to get out of it. So therefore, if you've got high sunk costs, which is typical with primary goods, it is likely to be price inelastic in supply. But if it's like a bagel thing, which you can buy a bit of equipment, produce your bagels, and suddenly baguettes go more profitable. You can easily change from bagels to baguettes, or vice versa from baguettes to bagels. So therefore, you do not have, it's a secondary product, you do not have high sunk costs to the degree that you can't change from one to the other, right? And therefore, depending on the nature of the product will depend on its price elasticity of supply. Generally, primary products tend to be price inelastic in supply, and secondary products tend to be price elastic in supply. The consequence of something being price elastic in supply can be very nasty for the following reason. If times are good and there's high prices going for your product, there's no way you can sometimes reach the demand. You can't double the quantity of persimmons that easy. But if the world price falls for persimmons, you can't just suddenly shrug your shoulders and say, we will close our persimmon production line. Those persimmon trees are there. It'll take you 10 years before you manage to change your farm over. Do you understand? So the same would apply for coal mining and things like that. So therefore, the nature, on the whole, for the producer, if a product is price inelastic in supply, the news is not good. But it's good for the consumer. You know why? Because if the price goes down, that's great news for the consumer for the following reason. He's getting his persimmons half price. You see? That's one determinant. Your second determinant is whether you can get, whether they can eat, which is reflective of the further, is can you produce substitutes? So put that again, right? Possibilities of producing substitute products Let's give an example. Take the persimmons. Right? I'm going to contradict a few things that I said last time, because although this might be bad news, the substitutes might be good news. Let's say, for example, you're producing persimmons. There is no demand for persimmons. Suddenly, people don't like persimmons. There's an article saying that it's bad for your stomach. Don't buy them. You know what people might do? They might decide to make persimmon juice. Persimmon juice may be okay. Do you understand? So it's possible to be able to go from one to the other. If you can convert your the persimmons, in that case, into persimmon juice, which is a substitute good, that's fine. If you can't convert it into persimmon juice, then it's not fine. Now, if you're able to produce with what you ever have, right, you can, the price goes up, you can produce more. When the price goes down, you produce less. And you are able to be able to, with the same equipment, to be able to produce a substitute good, right, which is more marketable. Then it'll be like your bagels and baguettes. Right? Your product will be more elastic in supply. But if what you're producing, right, the moment the demand for that product goes, there's no, the price falls, there's nothing you can do with it, then because you can't easily take your factors of production and use what you have to produce something else. Like, for example, a coal mine, what are you going to use a coal mine for? Are you going to hire it out to tourists? Possible. But I think you'll get a lot of more money from mining coal than showing the tourists around it. So therefore, coal is a product which is very much price inelastic in supply. Same with oil. What happens if we set up oil rigs and then suddenly there's no longer a demand for oil because we're all on electric vehicles that have to reduce the price of oil, right, very, very quickly in order to be able to sell it and take for whatever they can. So oil could be something that might be regarded as price elastic in supply because there are no substitutes for it. It's not a substitute good. And the third thing, time. And we'll conclude the talk with that. Time is an important factor for the following reason. That generally, the more time that you actually have, the more likely it is that your product is going to be elastic. Let's take the example of the persimmons. Let's say that suddenly the whole population preferred to buy guavas rather than persimmons. That's bad news. The demand for persimmons fell down and it really brought the price down, but there's still the same numbers of guavas on the market, so they've got to reduce the price drastically in order to sell them. But when time goes by, they might find that over time they can do one of two things. Firstly, they can adapt and produce guavas by changing each year a certain number of the trees. Over the years they can do it. So it's going to be less of a disaster over time. Another thing is that they might be able to find that some of the things that come from the guava can be adapted to other products such as medicinal products or within the chemical industry or whatever, and they may be able to find a use for it. Like, for example, in Britain, in the 1960s and 70s, shipbuilding used to be a very big industry, but then it closed down because they were able to produce ships much more cheaply in other parts of the world. The question was, what are you going to do with the shipyards? And they had a good idea. At the beginning, there was high unemployment in cities like Glasgow, which depended on the shipyards. But they can get around that problem by using their same technology to be able to build oil rigs or other engineering things made up of steel. So over time, they did not necessarily have to close the whole complex down, typically in Newcastle on Tyne, which had a similar problem. But instead, there was a business by actually being able to use the similar skills to be able to produce something else. But it took time to do it. So generally, the more time there is, the more elastic products become in supply, for the very good reason that more time gives them more chance of trying new technologies to be able to use the same premises to be able to produce the same goods, to be able to produce similar products. So we actually finish at this point. So what we've actually looked at is, we've looked at the issue of price elasticity of supply. We've found that products that tend, in summary, that tend to be price inelastic in supply, right, are those which, we found that conditions of inelasticity of supply, on the whole, tend to favour the consumer, but not the producer, because it means that the producer has to be able to, will be supplying a similar, only slightly fewer goods for often a much lower price, fewer products. But if the product is highly elastic in supply, then that means that it's easy, that it's easier for it's good news for the producer, because he's in a position where a slight amount, he can jump in and make a lot more profit, right? If it goes up, and if it goes down, it doesn't really matter, because he can very, very easily change over to something else. As a general rule that you should know, primary products tend to be price elastic in supply. Price inelastic in supply, sorry. And secondary products tend to be price elastic in supply, which means that producers in countries that specialize in primary products, which tend to be the poorer countries, the developing countries, can be far more vulnerable to a sudden fall in demand or increase, a sudden fall in demand at first and lower prices of primary products than developed countries, which tend to specialize much more in products which are price elastic in supply. So they can very easily adapt to changing conditions. Okay, well that concludes the talk on price elasticity of supply, and we're going to then move over from price elasticities to income elasticities. That will be the topic of our next meeting. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.